So you might have seen this trend popping up maybe online or heard someone talking about it, and it sounds completely wild. People claiming they're losing weight, feeling great, all while eating, well, a massive amount of carbohydrates, often sugar or candy.
Yeah, it's definitely caught some attention. We've been hearing whispers about this sugar diet, as some people are calling it.
Right, where protein and fat are kept incredibly low and the bulk of calories come from carbs. I mean, on the surface, it sounds like the exact opposite of everything we're usually told about nutrition.
It really does. It contradicts a lot of standard dietary advice.
Mhm.
The focus on sufficient protein for satiety and muscle, and often managing sugar intake pretty carefully.
Exactly. But then we started seeing these accounts, actual people reporting what seemed like, well, impossible results.
Oh.
So we grabbed the sources, some fascinating new research and observations from someone who really drilled down into the data to do a deep dive. Our mission here is to cut through the noise and understand the science. Why, against all logic, might this appear to work for some people? And just as importantly, what are the serious downsides and limitations?
And I have to say, when you actually look at the data from the research, the initial skepticism is totally understandable. But the scientific findings are genuinely surprising. They shed light on some really fundamental processes in our metabolism.
Okay, let's dive in then. Based on the accounts from people who've observed this trend, what does this sugar diet actually look like in practice? What are people doing?
Well, from what's been reported, the macronutrient breakdown is pretty extreme. Protein is very low, maybe around, say, zero 0.5 grams per pound of body weight.
That's really low.
It is. And fat is also kept super low, sometime under 30 grams for the whole day.
Wow, okay.
And the rest. The vast majority of calories come from carbohydrates, and often, yes, that includes a lot of sugar or candy.
And the sources give a specific example, right, to make it concrete.
They do. There's an example mentioned of a friend of the person analyzing the data, Mark Bell. For someone his size, around 209 pounds, he was reportedly consuming about 100 grams of protein,
Okay, 100 grams.
less than 30 grams of fat,
That's almost nothing.
and up to 800 grams of carbs daily.
800 grams of carbs.
Yep. Quick math tells you that's roughly 1,370 calories, with a staggering 83% of them from carbs, largely sugar.
83%. That's incredible. And the reports even mention him doing things like sugar fasts.
Yeah, that was mentioned too. Days consuming only sources like fruit, juice, maple syrup, honey, or even straight-up candy.
Yet the claims from people like him are rapid weight loss, fat loss, amazing results. It sounds too good to be true.
Which naturally makes you ask,
Sure.
Is this real or just anecdotal noise? Is something else entirely going on?
Okay, and here's where the source material delivers a really compelling aha
Yeah.
moment, right? It points to a pivotal new study.
Exactly. Published in a top journal, Nature Metabolism. This research specifically investigated what happens to energy expenditure, basically. How many calories your body burns on these low-protein, high-carb diets.
And who was in this study?
They studied healthy young men, mid-20s, relatively lean, mean BMI around 25.
So not necessarily representative of everyone, but a starting point.
Right. And the design was this. Participants followed a diet for 5 weeks that was just 9% protein and 70% carbs by calories.
Okay, low protein, high carb.
Then they switched them to a higher protein diet, 18% protein, for another 5 weeks as a comparison.
And the findings were pretty jaw-dropping from what I read.
They really were. About a week into the low-protein, high-carb phase, these guys needed to eat significantly more food just to keep their weight stable.
More food just to not lose weight.
Yes. By week 5, they were consuming 19% more calories per day. That's over 570 extra calories on average. And despite that huge increase in food, they still lost about 1 kilogram of weight.
Wait, so they ate almost 600 extra calories a day and still lost weight without exercising more?
Correct. And this wasn't because they suddenly became gym fanatics or built a ton of muscle. Their physical activity levels didn't change, and they didn't gain muscle mass.
That's remarkable.
It is. And the same finding, needing roughly 20% more calories to maintain weight on the low-protein diet, was confirmed in a second group of young men in this study. So it seemed robust, at least in this population.
Okay, so something was definitely making their bodies burn more calories without extra effort. But the big question is what? Was it the high carbs, the sugar maybe, or was it the low protein causing this metabolic boost?
That was the crucial next step. The researchers designed a third part of the study specifically to figure this out.
How'd they do that?
Right. They kept the protein very low again, at 9% of calories, same as before. But this time they swapped out a lot of the carbs for fat. So the diet became 9% protein, 41% carbs, and 50% fat.
Okay, so protein is still low, but now fat is high and carbs are much lower.
Exactly. So the test is clear. If the sugar diet magic was truly the high carbs or sugar, this diet should have shown a different result, right? Less of an effect, maybe.
Makes sense. But if the effect was really about restricting protein, you'd expect the same metabolic change regardless of the carb-fat ratio.
Precisely. And the results were conclusive. On the low-protein, higher-fat diet, the outcome was virtually identical.
Really? Same thing.
Pretty much. By the end of 5 weeks, participants needed to eat 21% more calories per day to maintain their body weight. Again, with no change in physical activity.
Wow. So in these healthy young men, the data strongly suggests it wasn't the high sugar or even the low fat that mattered most for this energy burning effect?
It seems not. The increased energy expenditure came from restricting protein.
Okay, that's a huge finding. But it immediately leads us to the next question. How? How does restricting protein make your body just burn more calories without doing anything extra? What's the biological switch being flipped?
That's the fascinating part. The source material points to a specific hormone that seems to be the key player, FGF21.
FGF21. What's that?
It stands for fibroblast growth factor 21. The research showed that when protein intake was restricted, FGF21 levels in the body surged dramatically.
Like dramatically.
In some cases, up to 361%. This happened after low-protein meals, and interestingly, it happened regardless of whether those meals were high in carbs or high in fat.
So step one seems clear. Low protein equals high FGF21.
Pretty much. That seems to be the initial signal.
And what does this FGF21 do? Where does it send its signal? What's its job?
A key place it acts is on fat cells. The researchers looked inside the fat cells and found that increased FGF21 levels were linked to changes in the mitochondria.
Okay, the mitochondria, those are the tiny power plants inside our cells, right? Turning food into energy.
Exactly, you got it. Think of them as power plants. These power plants use a complex process, kind of like a mini waterfall, to generate energy.
Okay, waterfall.
Well, the FGF21 signal seemed to increase the machinery that builds the potential energy at the top of the waterfall, specific components of the electron transport chain, complexes 1, 3, and 4.
So more water pressure building up.
Sort of, but at the same time, it seemed to decrease the machinery that efficiently captures that energy at the bottom to make usable fuel for the cell that's called ATP synthase.
So you're building up this potential energy, but you're making the turbines that actually generate the useful power less efficient.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. This leads to something called mitochondrial uncoupling.
Uncoupling sounds inefficient.
It is. Instead of all that potential energy being efficiently captured and packaged into ATP, which is like the cell's rechargeable battery, a significant portion is simply released as heat. The power plant is running, it's processing fuel, but a lot of the energy is just leaking out as warmth instead of being stored or used effectively.
And that leaky energy, that heat, is the extra calories being burned.
That's the theory, and it fits the data perfectly. This FGF21-driven mitochondrial uncoupling seems to explain the study results. Protein restriction spikes FGF21, which tells fat cell mitochondria to become less efficient, essentially wasting energy by burning more calories as heat.
And that could account for the extra calories needed.
It could. That metabolic boost might account for that roughly 20% increase in energy expenditure observed, like burning an extra 400 calories on a 2,000-calorie diet just through this biological process without moving more.
That's incredible. And the sources mentioned they confirmed this mechanism somehow, like double-checked it.
Yes, they did some crucial follow-up experiments. They used mice that were genetically modified not to produce FGF21 at all.
Okay, FGF21 knockout mice.
Right. Normal mice, when put on a low-protein diet, showed the expected metabolic changes needing to eat more, similar to humans. But the mice without FGF21, they didn't show these effects when their protein was restricted.
So that really pins it on FGF21 being the cause, the signal driving this.
It strongly suggests FGF21 is indeed the signal driving this metabolic adaptation in response to low protein, at least in these models.
Okay, so the bottom line based on this data is the sugar diet seems to trigger weight loss for some people, not because of the sugar itself, but because restricting protein cranks up FGF21, which then tells their fat cells to burn energy inefficiently via this mitochondrial uncoupling.
Which makes calling it the sugar diet really misleading, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely.
As the source puts it, the sugar diet name is kind of busted in light of this data. The metabolic effect came from the low protein, whether the rest of the diet was high in carbs or high in fat.
This even leads to a fascinating prediction mentioned in the source material.
Right, the idea that a low-protein, very high-fat diet, like a really restrictive ketogenic diet that might be, say, 9% protein and 90% fat, could potentially produce similar metabolic effects.
Because the protein is still low.
Exactly, because of the protein restriction. And there's even some mouse data suggesting that kind of diet might enhance FGF21 signaling pathways, potentially amplifying the effect.
Interesting. But here's the absolutely critical next question, the one we need to spend time on. These studies were done on healthy, lean young men over just 5 weeks. Who should not look at this data and decide to try living on candy?
Yes, this is crucial. That is the million-dollar question. Because the answer is, many people should be extremely cautious or probably avoid this entirely.
Why? What's the main reason?
The source highlights that obesity appears to be a state of FGF21 resistance.
Resistance, meaning the signal doesn't get through properly.
Exactly. Think of FGF21 as a signal your body sends. In obesity, even if you have high levels of FGF21 circulating, the signal might be loud. Your cells, particularly fat cells, might not hear it properly. It's like having a strong cell phone signal but a broken antenna on your phone. The message doesn't get through effectively.
So the hormone is there, but it's not working right.
Often, yes. People with obesity frequently have higher baseline FGF21 levels, and these levels often correlate with metabolic issues like high insulin and triglycerides, low HDL. But it doesn't seem to be doing its job effectively in those cases.
So if you're carrying excess weight or have metabolic issues, your body might not give you that big FGF21 surge when you cut protein.
Or, even if it does surge, your fat cells might not respond to it with the same energy-burning uncoupling effect that was seen in the lean steady participants.
The potential metabolic benefits simply might not happen.
It might not. Or it could potentially lead to other negative outcomes depending on your individual metabolic state. It's just not predictable based on this limited data from lean individuals.
And genetics adds another layer of complexity, right? The source mentions that variations in the FGF21 gene itself are actually pretty common.
Oh, very common. There's one specific variant, RSA38133, that nearly half the population carries at least one copy of. Its minor allele frequency is around 44.7%.
Wow, almost half. And what do these variations do?
Well, it's complex, but they can influence how much FGF21 your body produces in response to something like low protein, and also potentially how your body responds to that signal. For instance, that common variant has been linked, somewhat paradoxically, to lower total body fat overall.
Okay, that sounds good.
But also, ironically, to an increased waist-to-hip ratio, meaning maybe more central fat and higher blood pressure. So it's not straightforward.
So your personal genetic blueprint can affect both your FGF21 response and potentially even where you store fat, completely separate from the diet itself.
Absolutely. And this leads directly to the concept of non-responders. The source discusses another study, a really interesting one, using a calorimeter.
That's a special room that measures exact calorie burn. Heard.
Exactly. In that study, they put individuals on a very low protein diet, just 3% protein, and they found huge variation in how much people's FGF21 levels increased in response.
So some people got a big surge, others not so much.
Precisely. And the key finding was this. The people who had a bigger surge in FGF21 in the short term also burned more energy in the calorimeter. And importantly, when they looked 6 months later, those same high responders had gained less weight on a low-protein diet compared to those whose FGF21 didn't surge as much.
This really drives home the point about individual differences, doesn't it? It's not one size fits all.
Not at all. Let's try to summarize the practical implications regarding who responds and why, based on all this. 1, restricting protein generally increases FGF21.
Okay.
2, the magnitude of that increase seems crucial for whether you actually get that extra energy burning benefit.
Right. The size of the surge matters.
3, your individual response. Now, how big that surge is heavily influenced by your genetics and your current metabolic health, especially if you have obesity or related conditions.
Makes sense.
And 4, because obesity often involves this FGF21 resistance, you should be extremely cautious about assuming you'll get the same benefit seen in studies on lean, healthy young men. The odds might be against it.
Okay, so that covers who might or might not respond. But beyond that, what are the risks if someone did try this kind of extreme sugar diet for longer than the 5 weeks studied? 5 weeks is just a snapshot, really.
That's a major concern, definitely. If you're consuming hundreds and hundreds of grams of sugar every day, that means you're consuming a huge amount of fructose.
Right, because table sugar is half fructose and things like high fructose corn syrup.
Exactly. Now, normally, your small intestine is pretty good at processing fructose, converting a lot of it into other things like glucose or lactate before it even hits your liver. It acts like a protective gatekeeper.
A filter, kind of.
Yes, a metabolic filter. But with the massive doses involved in some versions of this diet, we're talking potentially hundreds of grams of fructose. That filter can just get overwhelmed. Flooded. This could expose your liver to very high levels of fructose over extended periods, and that has the potential to cause significant metabolic problems down the line, like fatty liver disease or worsening insulin resistance.
It's the body adapt.
The source acknowledges the body might adapt to higher fructose loads over time, but it's absolutely a high-stakes gamble with your liver health. We just don't have long-term data on that kind of intake.
And what about just basic nutrition, if your main food groups are essentially sugar and candy?
That's the second huge long-term risk. While it's true that carbohydrates aren't strictly essential nutrients, your body can make glucose from protein or fat if needed. There are essential fats like omega-3s and omega-6s, and essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein, plus fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K that need fat for absorption.
So you'd be missing out on a lot.
Hugely. A diet that relies heavily on low-nutrient sources like candy, juice, and refined sugar for 80% or more of its calories is extremely likely to lead to deficiencies in these critical nutrients over time.
And the source clarifies this isn't necessarily all low-protein diets, right?
Correct. The source is careful to point out that you could construct a low-protein diet using more nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah.
But specifically this low-nutrient, high-candy version of the sugar diet trend that people are talking about, that's a recipe for nutrient deficiencies.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What does this all mean for you, the listener, thinking about this wild trend? This deep dive into the sugar diet, as counterintuitive as it sounds, gives us a truly fascinating look at the power of macronutrient balance and specific hormonal signals, like FGF21, on our metabolism.
The data showing increased energy expenditure with protein restriction in some individuals is scientifically really interesting, genuinely thought-provoking. But let's be crystal clear. This research is absolutely not a free pass or some kind of health justification to start eating excessive amounts of candy and junk food.
Right. Sugar isn't some secret metabolic weapon you've been missing out on. And conversely, this doesn't mean carbs are inherently bad for everyone either, as the high-fat, low-protein arm of the study showed a similar effect.
Exactly. The most crucial takeaway, the one you should absolutely carry with you from this deep dive, is the profound impact of individual variation.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
It really does. Your unique metabolic health status right now, your genetic background, how your body specifically responds to dietary changes, like how much FGF21 your body produces and how sensitive your cells are to it, all of that dramatically influences whether an approach like this might provide a temporary benefit, do nothing much, or potentially lead to significant health issues.
It completely challenges the idea that there's one perfect diet out there for everyone.
Absolutely. So perhaps let this be something for you to ponder. How much do your own personal biology and your genetics actually shape your response to different ways of eating? And knowing that variability exists, how should that shape your perspective the next time a popular, maybe even extreme diet trend pops up?
It encourages a more critical and maybe more personalized look at things.
Definitely. The scientific data is out there, it's complex, it's evolving, and your own body holds some of the key answers. Stay curious, keep exploring the science, but maybe be wary of the quick fix fads.